We talked about legal things, about fiscal, just real brief things. Going more further now with Ineke Koele. You saw about talking about donations, talking about loans, talking about equity. And you can do that in the perspective from the one who is providing finance, but also the one who is receiving the finance. And when you go further down at that time into fiscal matters, you see that there are still a lot of questions. Ineke.
Thank you. Technical stuff. Hello. 10 to 15 minutes on tax issues of crowdfunding. That's absolutely impossible. What I will do only today is just to give you a glimpse of what tax issues of crowdfunding are or might be, and then at the end of the day, we still have to conclude that there are many aspects that may be included, but I could only touch upon in 10 minutes. So that's why I wrote down yesterday evening Tales of the Unexpected. I think that's the basic thing we have to take into account. The problem, as I see with crowdfunding in practice, is that many people, at least the people who are raising, who are looking for the funds to be achieved, do not really take into account any tax aspects. I don't know whether that's sure for the people, all the people in the audience, because it struck me positively this morning that there were so many people already mentioning tax aspects. So people are looking into this. But it also struck me that the SEEDS initiative of ABN AMRO mentions on the website very vague connotations in relation to income tax, both in relation to the funder and in relation to the recipient of the funds. So the question, of course, over there is as well, what kind of issues do we have to expect, or at least try to avoid that the tax man comes in rather unexpected? See how this works. Yeah. Crowdfunding or crowd investing, I hear different notions this morning already, is rather undefined. At least from a lawyer's perspective, is rather undefined. I have been browsing a little bit on the internet, and I found one definition. It is by a publicist which is called Matthew Iglesias on the internet, which I found rather interesting and perhaps the most accurate definition of crowdfunding is. He mentioned is the sacrifice of potential earnings for the sake of passion. And just to illustrate this a little bit, he says people are not doing this because it's an optimal investment strategy, but because they are enthusiastic about the idea. Organizations like Kickstarter in the US give investors the chance to do what workers and small business people have been doing forever, sacrificing potential earnings for the sake of passion. But what does that mean from a legal perspective? Sacrificing potential earnings for the sake of passion. It gives a clue that there is some non-business element in it. So funding may mean giving. And we hear that there are some initiatives that really take the form of gifts and not something else. It also may take the form of lending. But I heard somebody saying this morning lending is not the appropriate form for crowd investment, for crowdfunding. It may be investing, which is not the same, of course. It's hinting to an equity-based type of crowdfunding. I heard people say, relative to the SEEDS initiative, that it's nor a loan nor an investment. It's not equity, it's not a loan. It should be an UFO, but that does not exist in law. It's always something. And probably it's a combination of a loan and equity. And lawyers do refer to that kind of thing as mezzanine financing. But anyway, it can be qualified legally. But if the intentions and the precise details are so insecure, the question is, of course, what the outcome is of any discussion on the qualification of what people are doing. Another insecurity, I think, is that it's not always certain whether somebody is giving to a crowdfunding platform. We all know what is more or less meant by that, but what does it mean in a legal sense? Is it an independent entity? Who is the recipient? If the recipient is an OMNI, like the arts initiative, yes, then the OMBI, the charity, is the recipient of the funds, because it has to in order to obtain tax relief for the donors. However, in all other circumstances, probably the platform will not be the recipient, but probably the ultimate beneficiary of the funds. Quite important to identify. The person who is providing funds, in what capacity would that person provide funds? Is that in the capacity of an investor, a passive investor, or is that in the capacity of a high-risk entrepreneur, which might have quite different tax consequences? Or is it a donor? That means, is the personal relationship with the ultimate beneficiary probably the most important thing, like the friends and family connotations? Or is it something in between? For example, is it an investment with a donative part included in it? Because there is a donative intent, but there is also a quid pro quo. There is a remuneration given back to the donor in terms of a product. What is the value of the gift and what is the value of the investment? All very difficult, nasty issues for the taxman. And even if those kind of funds are raised in an international landscape, the mismatches between the tax consequences might be draconic, because the question, whatever is a gift or is an investment or is an income in the sense in the hands of the recipient, might be treated quite differently from country to country. If you look into the internet, there are stories going on, people telling to each other, if somebody is raising funds through a crowdfunding platform, that is very likely to generate income in the hands of this person. Of course, that depends on the precise conditions of the funds. As I was looking onto the Seeds platform, there is a kind of obligation to repay the fund. And if that is the case, probably it's not a direct income at least. Only in case the repayment obligation could not be fulfilled, it might become an income in that sense and that moment. So it's dependent very much on the precise details of the agreement. If there are precise details of the agreement, of course. Let me see. So, and it's not only about tax, of course. I missed that a little bit in the discussion until today. It's also, it's not only regulatory tax, it's also a kind of regulatory thing. But I think the basic agreements that people are making with each other, even though, or perhaps despite the fact that there is a passionate element in it, should be very clear. If we're talking about intentions of parties, contracting parties, those intentions should be clarified in this very complex kind of agreements. If people are mixing up titles in general, that is the strongest reason why people are ending up in conflicts. Because one party thinks it's more or less a donation, and the other party expects, it's also an expectation, expects something in return. So to start with, titles should be clear. What title is related to what consideration, to what efforts, and to what funds. Substance over form is more or less the same format. A funding agreement or a funding activity can take whatever form, but basically what people really want to achieve is decisive, at least from a tax point of view. The taxman always qualifies later on what has been happening and how people have been behaving after the circumstances have developed as they have done. So as I said already, and I think that is an important one, you see that on the internet as well, discussions on funds being achieved that constitute income. Even if it's presented, even if the funds are presented as gifts, but are directly received by a business individual, 9 to 10 situations, those gifts will directly constitute income, and therefore be subject to income tax, which go up to 52% in the Netherlands, but that's different, of course. It may also create some sort of partnerships, silent partnerships, with all kinds of consequences that might not be foreseen at the start, but it may be debts, or at least it may be gifts. But even if it's a gift, finally it's a gift, there is a donative intent. The donative intent is paramount. Then the question is, could that trigger gift tax? That is a scenario that can only be avoided, unless we're talking about very small amounts, but also the thresholds for gift tax vary from country to country. In the Netherlands, it's about 2,000 euros per gift per annum. But if the amounts involved exceed that amount, and an organization does not qualify as a charity, or the activities of the delivery of the funds to the final beneficiaries do not qualify in accordance with all the regulations on what a charity may or may not do, then there is gift tax involved. And the rates are quite substantial. 30% in the Netherlands above 2,000 euros, and above 110,000 euros the rates go up to 40. The funder, may that person have an income tax deduction? When, if it's a gift, it may, if all the requirements for a charity has been obtained. If it's not a gift, but an investment, it depends whether it's part of a business enterprise or not, whether there is a relationship, a family relationship between the investor and the ultimate beneficiary. There are very specific circumstances that may count in that relationship as well. Last but not least, VAT is an issue that is quite often overlooked, especially if the beneficiary of funds wants to give something back to the donor or funder. The value, and there is a value attached to that product or service, then at the end of the day, there is a VAT consequence in nearly all countries. And even in the US, we consider sales tax in that respect. Seldom, quite often overlooked. And one of the things I think that should be looked at a little bit more often, and I discussed that earlier this week with Lucas as well, is that many platforms could take the form, in my view, of a charity, even if they are employing ultimate beneficiaries, which is a scenario never looked at. If the activities of such an organization have a public purpose, we all are speaking today about the public purpose of growing small businesses using talents of people, which, if you qualify that in the right legal vehicle, legal device, may qualify as public interest pursuing. So, and just to accept the challenge a little bit that there might be some humor in tax issues, I finished. This is of course in Dutch, but a literal translation is quite easy to make. Tax, in fact, is a kind of compulsory crowdfunding, which is drafted by the famous Lucia in the Netherlands. Thank you.
I have one question and one thing for going further. One question for you, Ineke. You mentioned also about regulation in the UK, which is quite interesting to see, because IceCube, one of the crowdfunding platforms in the UK, was quite involved in this new kind of regulation.
Yes. We've seen that back in April this year, so 2 months ago, there was a new investment introduced in the UK. It's called the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme. It's a scheme that allows investors to have a tax reduction of 50% of an investment. So the rate is 50% up to an amount of £100,000. And there's an incubator to that facility, because it only applies for the year 2012, 2013, so the tax year. If people are selling investments and are making a capital gain, which is taxable in the UK, then they can avoid the capital gain on the sale by using the same funds in the same period in this new scheme. So it's really a kickstart on this new tax relief that has been introduced in the UK quite recently. And there are rumors going around in Canada and many countries who are more or less trying to introduce similar incentives. Yes.
Thank you, Ineke. We planned to go immediately towards the tables for kind of discussion. We do what we did already on legal, also now for fiscal, but we